Control is rarely seized. It is granted silently, willingly, without your conscious consent. Before desire sharpens, the mind has already begun to wait. Before obsession forms, absence is interpreted as meaning. What feels like attraction is often a response to something deliberately incomplete. The most potent influence does not push. It creates a gap, and the mind leans forward on its own. Long before resistance falters, the brain rehearses surrender in subtle, unquestioned ways. And by the time hunger is recognized, it already feels personal. So the question lingers: who taught your mind to crave what refuses to appear? If this unsettles you, mark the moment. Hit like to acknowledge it, share to see if others feel it too, and comment the thought that stays with you. And stay with us. The deeper you watch, the more the mind reveals. Chapter 1. The Allure of the Unavailable. You already know this, even if you have never said it out loud. The moment something becomes fully available to you, it begins to lose its quiet pull. Not dramatically. Not all at once, just enough that you stop leaning forward. Just enough that the tension fades. You tell yourself it is natural. You tell yourself it means you are mature, rational, no longer easily impressed. But beneath that explanation sits a simpler truth. What is reachable stops whispering to you. The mind is not drawn to what it understands. It is drawn to what remains unresolved. You have felt this in small, ordinary moments. A message that arrives instantly feels different from one that arrives hours later. A person who explains themselves completely feels lighter, less dense than someone who leaves gaps. A door that is always open becomes part of the background. A door that stays closed starts to occupy space in your thoughts. This is not romance. It is not mystery for its own sake. It is perception responding to distance. When something is unavailable, your mind does not leave it alone. It circles it. It revisits it. It adds weight where none may exist. Research in behavioral psychology has long shown that scarcity inflates perceived value, even when the object itself has not changed. The same item, the same person, the same opportunity, framed as limited or inaccessible, is judged as more desirable, more important, more worthy of pursuit. Not because it is better, but because it resists confirmation. Distance does something subtle. It prevents closure. And the mind dislikes open loops. Cognitive tension builds when resolution is denied. The unanswered message, the unreadable expression, the invitation that never arrives. Each absence becomes a stimulus. Your attention returns to it without your permission. This is not obsession. It is completion-seeking behavior. The brain trying to finish a pattern it cannot see clearly. In everyday life, this appears quietly. You notice how little you think about people who are always emotionally present. They are safe, predictable, mentally categorized. Then there is the one who remains just out of reach. Not hostile, not warm, simply unavailable enough to avoid definition. Your thoughts drift there more often than you expect. Not because of what they do, but because of what they withhold. Psychological research on uncertainty shows that variable reinforcement holds attention more effectively than consistent reward. When outcomes are unpredictable, the brain releases more dopamine in anticipation, not in satisfaction. The wanting becomes more stimulating than the having. Availability resolves anticipation. Absence keeps it alive. You do not desire the person, you desire the possibility they represent. Neutrality, when filtered through distance, begins to look like depth. Silence begins to resemble confidence. Ambiguity is mistaken for complexity. The mind fills in the blanks with qualities it prefers. This is not imagination. It is projection driven by incomplete data. You have done this without noticing. You have attributed meaning to pauses that carried none. You have read intent into restraint. You have interpreted emotional absence as selectiveness, as standards, as quiet authority. Meanwhile, what was fully present felt ordinary even when it was genuine. This is how rarity becomes confused with importance. When access is limited, the mind assumes there must be a reason. Something valuable must be protected. Something special must be scarce. This assumption operates automatically. Studies on consumer psychology demonstrate that limited availability increases perceived quality, even when participants are told the limitation is artificial. Knowing does not cancel the effect. Awareness does not dissolve it. You are not immune. The unavailable does not need to impress you. It only needs to remain unresolved. The lack of confirmation creates space, and space invites interpretation. Interpretation becomes attachment. Consider how little effort absence requires. It does not persuade, it does not argue, it simply withholds. And in that withholding, it shifts the balance of attention. You lean in, you monitor, you wait. Your inner state begins to adjust around something that is not fully there. This is not weakness. It is pattern recognition misfiring under uncertainty. The mind evolved to prioritize what is rare because rarity once signaled survival relevance. Limited resources mattered. Elusive opportunities mattered. That ancient prioritization still operates, even in environments where scarcity is symbolic rather than real. An emotionally unavailable person triggers the same circuitry as a scarce resource. Attention sharpens, value inflates. Importance is assigned before evidence arrives. Meanwhile, availability carries a different signal. Consistency feels safe, but safety is cognitively quiet. It does not demand rehearsal. It does not provoke mental simulation. It does not interrupt your day with intrusive thoughts. So it fades into the background, even when it is healthier, even when it is more aligned with your stated values. You tell yourself you want clarity, yet clarity ends the chase, and the chase stripped of its language is stimulation. There is a moment when desire does not come from attraction but from denial, when wanting is not about connection but about restoring equilibrium. The mind feels slightly destabilized by absence and seeks to correct it. Desire becomes a corrective impulse, not toward the person, but toward the discomfort they accidentally created. This is why rejection often intensifies interest rather than extinguishing it. Social psychology has consistently observed that moderate rejection increases desirability, especially when it is ambiguous rather than absolute. Clear rejection closes the loop. Ambiguous rejection keeps it open. The mind keeps returning, searching for a different outcome. You begin to think more about what you could have said, what you might still say, how you were perceived. Not because the person is extraordinary, but because the interaction never fully resolved. Absence promises something quietly dangerous. It promises meaning, not actual meaning, perceived meaning, the kind that forms in silence where nothing contradicts it. In the absence of data, the mind substitutes narrative, and the narrative often flatters both sides. The unavailable becomes refined, selective, powerful. You become uniquely affected, unusually interested, somehow chosen by your own attention. This dynamic rarely announces itself. It feels personal. It feels intuitive. It feels like chemistry. But chemistry in this context is often just uncertainty paired with imagination. You see this pattern repeat across domains. A job offered delayed feels more significant than one extended quickly. Praise given sparingly feels heavier than praise given freely. Approval that must be earned feels more validating than approval that is offered. The brain responds not to the content, but to the friction involved in obtaining it. Ease cheapens, resistance sanctifies. Yet the resistance does not have to be intentional. Many forms of unavailability are accidental. Emotional guardedness, distraction, inconsistency. These traits, when filtered through perception, can produce the same effect as deliberate distance. The impact on the observer is the same. Desire forms around the gap, not the person. You are rarely attracted to what is present. You are attracted to what withholds just enough to remain undefined. This is why confirmation reduces fascination. Once you know where you stand, the mental activity slows. Once the ambiguity collapses, the imagined qualities must compete with reality. Reality is rarely as stimulating as anticipation, so the feeling shifts, not because something was lost, but because something ended. And endings are quieter than beginning. There is a subtle complicity here. You participate in sustaining your own wanting. Each time you revisit the absence, you reinforce its significance. Each time you assign meaning to silence, you deepen the imprint. Over time, the desire feels self-generated, as if it arose from genuine preference rather than cognitive mechanics. But the mechanics are there, operating calmly, reliably. You do not chase what you have, you chase what escapes definition. The most unsettling part is not that this happens. It is that it feels like choice while it unfolds. You believe you are responding to value, to depth, to something rare. In reality, you are responding to incomplete information and the tension it creates inside you. Absence does not promise fulfillment, it promises continuation. And as long as something remains unavailable, the mind is free to want without correction, free to invest without feedback, free to desire without evidence. The question that remains is not why you are drawn to what you cannot have. It is what part of you keeps mistaking silence for substance. Chapter 2. Silence as Invitation. You have noticed this before, even if you never framed it this way. Silence does not feel empty to you, it feels loaded. When someone does not respond, when nothing is offered, when words are withheld, your mind does not rest. It becomes alert, it leans forward. It begins working on your behalf without asking permission. You tell yourself you are simply waiting. In truth, you are already imagining. Silence is never neutral inside the mind. It is interpreted the moment it appears. You live in a world saturated with signals. Messages arrive instantly. Explanations are expected. Reactions are visible and constant. Against that background, silence stands out not as absence, but as contrast. It breaks the rhythm your brain relies on to feel oriented. And when orientation is disrupted, the mind fills the gap on its own. You do not need someone to speak in order to feel influenced by them. In many cases, the lack of response does more work than any sentence could. Psychological research on ambiguity tolerance shows that when information is missing, individuals experience mild cognitive discomfort. The brain responds by generating interpretations to restore balance. This process is automatic. It is not a choice. Silence becomes a stimulus precisely because it withholds resolution. You have felt this in ordinary situations. A message read but not answered. A pause that lasts longer than expected. A question met with nothing at all. You notice the gap immediately. Your attention returns to it again and again, not because it is dramatic, but because it is unfinished. Words limit meaning. Silence does not. When someone speaks, they define themselves. Their tone, their intent, their position become clearer. Silence avoids definition, and what remains undefined becomes a canvas. The mind projects onto it, often idealizing what it cannot verify. This is not optimism. It is pattern completion under uncertainty. Studies in social cognition have shown that people attribute greater depth and intention to individuals who disclose less information, especially early on. The absence of data encourages inference. Inference feels like insight. Insight feels personal. You begin to believe you are seeing something others might miss. You are not responding to the person. You are responding to the space they left open. Silence sustains anticipation because it delays outcome. Anticipation activates reward pathways more strongly than reward itself. Dopamine increases not when certainty arrives, but while the outcome remains unknown. A delayed response keeps the system engaged. A non-response extends it indefinitely. You tell yourself you want clarity, yet silence keeps you thinking longer than clarity ever could. Consider how quickly interest fades once everything is said. Once intentions are explained, once meaning is confirmed. The mental activity slows, the emotional charge dissipates. Silence, by contrast, keeps the mind active without resolution. It allows desire to exist without being tested against reality. This is why silence often feels powerful even when it is unintentional. A person does not need to craft a message to influence you. They only need to refrain from offering one. The lack of effort on their part produces effort on yours. Meaning is generated without external input. The entire process unfolds internally, yet it feels relational. You may recognize this pattern in yourself. How quickly you begin to assign reasons to silence. They must be busy, they must be thinking, they must be deliberate. You search for explanations that preserve significance. The possibility that silence means nothing feels harder to accept than the idea that it means something important. The mind prefers a charged interpretation to an empty one. This is not imagination running wild. It is attribution bias under conditions of ambiguity. When information is missing, people tend to assume intention rather than random. Silence feels intentional, even when it is not, and intention feels meaningful. Silence also benefits from asymmetry. The person who speaks reveals themselves. The person who stays quiet remains protected. This imbalance shifts attention. You begin to focus more on the one who offers less, not because they give more, but because they demand interpretation. Research on conversational dynamics shows that individuals who speak less are often perceived as more authoritative, more self-possessed, and more selective. Silence is mistaken for confidence. Restraint is mistaken for control. The mind fills in qualities that words would have contradicted. You have seen this effect beyond relationships. A leader who pauses before responding feels more deliberate than one who answers immediately. A brand that withholds information creates more speculation than one that explains everything. Silence invites curiosity because it refuses to satisfy it. In personal interactions, the effect is sharper. Emotional silence activates attachment mechanisms more strongly than emotional expression. The lack of feedback triggers monitoring behavior. You pay closer attention, you reread interactions, you scan for signals that may not exist. This sustained attention creates familiarity. Familiarity creates attachment. Attachment feels like connection even when it formed in isolation. You are not connecting with the person. You are connecting with your own projections. Silence allows idealization because nothing contradicts it. Words introduce flaws. Silence preserves possibility. The less you know, the more room there is for perfection. This is why early-stage attraction often thrives on limited information. The mind builds an internal version that feels coherent and compelling. The danger is not that this happens. The danger is that it feels earned. You believe your interest deepened because you noticed something subtle, because you sensed depth, because you intuited complexity. In reality, your mind was working to reduce discomfort caused by not knowing. The story you constructed felt personal because it originated inside you. Silence also shifts responsibility. When nothing is said, you assume the work of interpretation. If meaning emerges, it feels self-discovered rather than given. Self-discovered meaning feels more convincing, it feels truer. This is why silence can feel like an invitation even when none was extended. Nothing is offered. Yet your mind offers everything. Explanations, motives, emotional significance. You begin to invest without being asked. And once invested, the silence feels heavier, more loaded, more important than before. The loop sustains itself. Lack of response prolongs anticipation because it never allows the nervous system to settle. There is no clear signal to disengage. No closure. The mind remains slightly alert, slightly unresolved. Over time, this state can be mistaken for interest, for attraction, even for emotional connection. But it is neither. It is unresolved attention. You may notice how relief follows a definitive response, even if the response is disappointing. Disappointment ends the loop. Silence extends it. The mind often prefers continuation to resolution, even when continuation is uncomfortable. This is not because you enjoy discomfort. It is because the system is designed to keep searching until certainty arrives. Silence exploits this design without effort. It is important to notice how quickly meaning forms in the absence of evidence. A delayed reply becomes a sign of emotional depth. A lack of reassurance becomes a sign of independence. Emotional unavailability becomes selectiveness. Each interpretation protects the value you have already assigned. This process rarely feels conscious. It unfolds quietly, beneath language. By the time you notice the pull, it already feels justified. You might tell yourself that silence creates mystery. That mystery is attractive. But mystery is simply unresolved information paired with attention. It feels profound because it engages your imagination, not because it contains truth. Silence does not communicate intention. It allows intention to be imagined, and imagination is rarely neutral. It bends toward what you want to believe, toward narratives that preserve significance, toward explanations that keep the object of your attention meaningful. This is where complicity enters. You are not a passive recipient of silence. You participate in its effect. Each time you return to it mentally, you reinforce it. Each time you interpret it, you deepen its presence. The silence itself remains unchanged. Only your internal response grows. Over time, the imagined meaning can feel more real than any words could have been. Words would risk collapse. Silence keeps the structure intact. The most unsettling realization is not that silence influences you. It is that the influence feels like insight. You believe you are sensing something others miss, reading between lines, understanding what is not said. In reality, you are responding to the absence of constraint. The mind is free to build without resistance. Silence invites projection because it offers no boundaries. And as long as nothing is said, nothing can be disproven. So the question is not why silence feels powerful. It is how much of what you want was ever offered to you at all. Chapter 3. Intermittent Presence. You have felt this before, even if you never named it. The connection that unsettles you most is rarely the one that stays. It is the one that appears, then fades, then returns just as you begin to regain balance. You tell yourself it is coincidence, timing, life being complicated. But beneath those explanations sits a quieter truth. What is unstable holds you longer than what is secure. Consistency soothes, inconsistency binds. The mind is not drawn only to pleasure, it is drawn to resolution. When contact is regular, the system learns what to expect. Anticipation settles into routine. Emotional arousal softens. Attention relaxes. But when presence is irregular, the system never fully adapts. It stays alert. It keeps checking. It remains engaged long after it should have rested. This is not drama. It is conditioning. Decades of psychological research on reinforcement have shown that unpredictable rewards create stronger, more persistent engagement than predictable ones. When outcomes arrive on an irregular schedule, the brain releases dopamine not at the moment of reward, but in the space before it. The uncertainty itself becomes activating. The mind begins working harder, not because the reward is greater, but because it is unstable. You experience this pattern outside of relationships without question. Games of chance, social media notifications. Any system that delivers rewards inconsistently holds attention longer than one that delivers them reliably. You do not need to enjoy the experience for it to grip you. You only need to believe the reward might return. Human presence is no different. When someone appears warmly, then withdraws without explanation, the nervous system registers both relief and loss. Relief when they return, loss when they vanish. This fluctuation creates contrast. Contrast sharpens memory. Each return feels more intense because it follows absence. Each absence feels heavier because it follows connection. The mind begins tracking patterns. What did you say last time? What changed? What might bring the presence back again? These questions do not arise in stable interactions. Stability requires no analysis. Instability demands it. You may notice how little you think about people who are consistently available. They occupy a known place. Your body understands them. There is no need to monitor, no need to rehearse. Then there is the one who comes close, then pulls away. Your thoughts drift there repeatedly, not because of intimacy, but because of interruption. Interruption keeps a process open. Research on attachment has consistently shown that inconsistent responsiveness increases anxiety and preoccupation. When emotional availability is unpredictable, individuals become more vigilant. They pay closer attention to signals. They invest more effort into maintaining connection. This is not because the connection is deeper, but because it feels unstable. The bond intensifies not through safety, but through uncertainty. You do not cling because you are weak. You cling because your system is trying to stabilize something that refuses to settle. Each disappearance triggers a subtle stress response. Each reappearance brings relief. Relief reinforces the cycle. Over time, the relief becomes associated with the person themselves. You begin to feel attached not to who they are, but to the oscillation they create. Predictability weakens attachment because it removes urgency. When you know what to expect, there is no need to secure the bond. It feels already secured. The mind reallocates attention elsewhere. Inconsistency, by contrast, signals risk. Risk demands focus. This is why intermittent presence often feels more intense than steady closeness. You may notice how quickly your mood adjusts around availability. A brief message after silence can lift you disproportionately. A delay after warmth can sink you faster than it should. These shifts feel emotional, but they are physiological. The nervous system responding to changing signals of connection. The brain treats social contact as a form of reward. When that reward is unstable, the brain increases effort to regain it. Not because the reward is essential, but because its absence feels unresolved. This process often masquerades as chemistry. You believe the connection is powerful because it moves you, but movement does not equal depth. Volatility creates sensation. Sensation feels like intensity. Intensity is mistaken for significance. Intermittent presence allows someone to occupy more mental space than constant presence ever could. When they are gone, you think about them. When they return, you feel them more strongly. Either way, they remain central. The most binding element is not contact. It is anticipation. Uncertainty sharpens focus. The mind begins scanning for cues, tone, timing. Small variations take on exaggerated meaning. A delayed reply feels loaded. A brief warmth feels promising. Each signal is overinterpreted because the system is searching for stability. Studies in cognitive psychology show that under conditions of uncertainty, people over-attribute meaning to minor cues. The brain becomes a pattern-finding machine, even when patterns are weak or non-existent. Intermittent presence creates the perfect environment for this distortion. You begin to feel that something important is happening, even when nothing concrete is changed. The inconsistency also shifts power quietly. The one who appears and disappears controls rhythm without speaking. They set the pace by withdrawing. You respond by waiting. Waiting invests attention. Attention deepens attachment. This dynamic does not require intention. It functions even when the person is unaware of their impact. The effect is created by timing, not motive. You might tell yourself that the bond feels strong because it survived distance, because it endured uncertainty. But endurance under instability often reflects effort, not compatibility. The system worked hard, so the outcome feels earned. Effort distorts value. When you invest energy into securing something, your mind increases its perceived importance to justify the cost. This is a well-documented cognitive bias. The more you work to maintain connection, the more meaningful it feels, regardless of the actual return. Intermittent presence extracts effort without offering clarity. That combination is potent. You may recognize how relief becomes addictive. Each reappearance calms the tension created by absence. Over time, you associate the person with relief itself, not with safety, not with consistency, but with the release of discomfort they help create. This is not fulfillment. It is regulation. The system oscillates between activation and calm, never fully settling. That unsettled state keeps the bond alive. It feels alive because it never resolves. Consistency ends this cycle. Inconsistency sustains it. There is also the quiet erosion of self-trust. When contact is unpredictable, you begin questioning your perceptions. Did you misread the closeness? Did you expect too much? Did you imagine the connection? This self-doubt increases dependence on external signals. You look to the other person for confirmation. Their next appearance feels validating. Their disappearance feels destabilizing. The attachment deepens because your internal reference point is weakened. This is how inconsistency binds without closeness. You are not attached to presence. You are attached to the swing between presence and absence. The return feels meaningful because it interrupts loss. The loss feels meaningful because it follows return. Each side intensifies the other. The mind bonds more tightly to what appears and disappears because it never receives enough information to disengage. There is always the possibility of return. Possibility sustains attention longer than certainty ever could. Certainty closes the loop. Uncertainty keeps it open. You might notice how difficult it is to let go of something that never fully stabilized. Endings that are clean allow the system to stand down. Endings that are ambiguous keep the system active. Intermittent presence creates an ending that never quite arrives. So the bond lingers, not because it was strong, but because it was unresolved. The most unsettling aspect is how natural this feels while it is happening. You do not experience it as conditioning. You experience it as connection forming, as something rare, as something worth holding on to. By the time you recognize the pattern, your attention has already been trained. You are left with a quiet question that does not resolve easily. Are you drawn to the person who comes and goes, or to the version of yourself that stays alert, waiting, hoping for their return? Chapter 4. Scarcity reframed as depth. You have felt this pull before, even if you never questioned it. When someone offers you less, you often assume there must be more beneath the surface. Limited access begins to feel like depth. Withholding starts to look like complexity. You sense it quietly, almost instinctively, and you rarely challenge it. Instead, you lean closer, convinced that what is scarce must be layered, nuanced, and emotionally rich. This assumption settles in without resistance. When explanation is missing, the mind does not accept emptiness. It compensates. It reframes absence as intention. Silence becomes subtlety. Distance becomes restraint. And restraint begins to look like inner complexity rather than lack. You have noticed how quickly this happens. A person who explains themselves fully feels easier to place, easier to understand, and once understood, easier to mentally set aside. But the person who remains partially inaccessible resists categorization. The mind struggles to place them. That struggle feels like engagement. Psychological research on ambiguity has shown that when information is incomplete, people tend to overestimate the depth of what remains unknown. The unknown is not evaluated neutrally. It is weighted. The absence of clarity creates a sense of hidden structure even when none exists. You are not drawn to depth. You are drawn to the illusion of it. Scarcity shifts perception without altering substance. When access is limited, the mind assumes selectiveness. When emotional availability is reduced, it is often interpreted as emotional complexity. The less someone offers, the more room there is to imagine what they are holding back. This is not curiosity. It is inference filling a vacuum. You experience this effect in everyday settings. A book that explains everything clearly feels complete but rarely lingers. A book that leaves gaps invites interpretation and feels richer, even when the content is thinner. In human interaction, the same principle applies. Explanation closes loops. Lack of explanation opens them. Open loops feel meaningful. Withholding, whether intentional or accidental, prevents contradiction. Words can be tested. Behavior can be evaluated. Silence cannot. When nothing is explained, nothing can be disproven. The mind remains free to assign qualities that align with its expectations and desires. This is where scarcity is reframed as depth. Someone who responds briefly is assumed to be thoughtful rather than disengaged. Someone who avoids emotional disclosure is seen as guarded rather than unavailable. Someone who disappears is framed as complex rather than inconsistent. Each interpretation preserves value by relocating the cause inward into imagined depth. The mind prefers this framing. It protects the emotional investment already formed. Research in social psychology has consistently shown that people attribute greater intelligence, complexity, and intentionality to individuals who communicate less especially when the silence is ambiguous. The absence of information is treated as a sign of something hidden, not something missing. You have participated in this distortion more times than you realize. When access is limited, desire does not fade. It redirects. Instead of seeking connection, the mind begins seeking meaning. Instead of responding to what is present, it responds to what is implied. Desire becomes cognitive rather than relational. You start interpreting rather than interacting. This interpretation feels active. It feels like insight. You believe you are understanding something subtle. In reality, you are supplying what was never given. The effort involved in interpretation increases the perceived value of its object. Effort justifies importance. The more you think about what someone might mean, the more meaningful they feel. Absence is romanticized because it allows imagination to operate without constraint. Clear presence introduces limits. It reveals flaws, contradictions, ordinariness. Absence protects against all of that. It preserves potential in its most flattering form. This is why ambiguity often feels more alluring than clarity. You might notice how quickly you excuse a lack of explanation when it comes from someone you already value. You assume there must be reasons you cannot see, depth you have not yet accessed, complexity that will eventually be revealed. This assumption keeps desire alive while postponing disappointment. Scarcity buys time. The mind reframes what it cannot have into something worth wanting. It transforms lack into mystery, mystery into significance, significance into emotional pull. This chain unfolds quietly, without conscious approval. You rarely stop to ask whether the depth you sense was ever demonstrated. Instead, you ask yourself what you might be missing. Studies on attribution bias show that when behavior is unclear, people tend to attribute causes to internal traits rather than external circumstances. Silence is interpreted as personality. Distance is interpreted as disposition. Limited access is interpreted as emotional architecture rather than situational constraint. This bias is powerful because it feels respectful. You believe you are giving the other person credit. In truth, you are filling gaps with assumption. You see this clearly in how explanation changes perception. Once someone explains their withdrawal, their distance often feels less profound. The mystery dissolves. The imagined complexity collapses into context. What felt deep begins to feel simple. This shift can feel disappointing, even when the explanation is reasonable. Not because the truth is bad, but because it ends the interpretive process that sustained desire. Meaning feels richer when explanation is missing because meaning is being generated internally. The mind enjoys this process more than it admits. Interpretation creates engagement without risk. You can imagine depth without confronting reality. You can admire complexity without encountering its limits. The other person remains intact because they remain undefined. Scarcity protects the fantasy from correction. You might recognize how quickly this dynamic creates imbalance. The one who offers less becomes the focus. The one who offers more becomes background. Availability reduces intrigue because it leaves little to interpret. Scarcity demands interpretation because it withholds confirmation. This is not about value. It is about attention. When access is limited, attention concentrates. Concentrated attention feels like attraction. Attraction feels like meaning. Meaning feels earned because it required effort to construct. The effort was yours, but the value is assigned to them. This is how desire is redirected away from connection and into cognition. You stop responding to what is happening and start responding to what you think might be happening. The relationship shifts from interaction to interpretation. You become attached to the story rather than the person. Research on cognitive investment shows that people value outcomes more when they have invested mental effort into understanding them. The same applies to people. The more you analyze someone, the more significant they feel, regardless of their actual behavior. Scarcity ensures that analysis never ends. Absence is romanticized because it cannot disappoint you directly. Only presence can do that. Only explanation can reveal ordinariness. Absence preserves idealization by remaining untouched. You may notice how often you defend scarcity by calling it subtlety. You tell yourself that not everything needs to be said, that some things are deeper when left unsaid. While this can be true in art and poetry, in human connection it often masks a simpler reality. What is not offered cannot be evaluated. The mind prefers evaluation postponed over evaluation denied. As long as explanation is missing, possibility remains. Possibility sustains desire longer than fulfillment ever could. This does not mean scarcity is always deceptive. It means perception is not neutral in its presence. The mind does not wait passively for information. It actively constructs it. And once constructed, it resists revision. You may feel slightly exposed recognizing this pattern, not because it is shameful, but because it reveals how much of what you felt was internally generated. The depth you sensed, the mystery you admired, the complexity you respected, all formed in response to what was not there. This realization does not dissolve the pull. Understanding rarely does, but it changes where the pull is located. The unsettling part is not that scarcity influences you. It is that the influence feels like discernment. You believe you are drawn to depth, to nuance, to emotional richness. But often you are drawn to what allows you to imagine those qualities without resistance. Scarcity reframed as depth keeps desire alive by shifting it from reality to interpretation. And as long as interpretation continues, the mind remains engaged. The question that lingers is not whether the depth was real. It is how much of what you felt ever needed someone else to exist at all. Chapter 5. Normalization of longing. There is a moment you rarely acknowledge. A moment when wanting stops feeling like a problem and starts feeling like a state. You no longer register it as lack, you register it as normal. The absence does not alarm you anymore. It settles in quietly, almost politely. And without realizing it, you begin to live inside it. This is where longing changes its role. At first, absence is sharp. It interrupts you. You notice it immediately. Something is missing and your body reacts. Attention tightens. Thoughts return again and again to the same place. The discomfort feels foreign, even urgent. You assume it will pass once the absence is resolved. But when absence repeats, the system adapts. The nervous system is designed to recalibrate. What is repeated becomes familiar. What is familiar becomes tolerated. Over time, the emotional baseline shifts. Longing does not disappear. It simply stops announcing itself as pain. It becomes background. This adaptation is subtle, but it is well documented. Psychological research on habituation shows that repeated exposure to the same stimulus reduces conscious response. Even when the stimulus remains unresolved, the mind does not eliminate discomfort. It lowers its signal. What once felt intolerable becomes manageable, then ordinary. You still want, you just no longer flinch. You have experienced this in everyday contexts. A delayed reply that once unsettled you now barely registers. An emotional distance that once triggered anxiety now feels expected. You begin to plan around absence rather than question it. The lack is no longer an event. It is a condition. Wanting becomes familiar. And familiarity has a strange effect. It softens resistance. The body learns how to carry the tension. The mind learns how to function around it. You still feel the pull, but it no longer feels disruptive. It feels integrated. This is how longing becomes comfortable. Neuroscience offers a clear explanation. Emotional states that persist without resolution often become baseline states. The brain conserves energy by reducing reactivity to chronic condition. What remains constant is no longer treated as a signal to act, but as an environment to endure. Hunger in this context stops signaling imbalance. You do not wake up every day thinking something is wrong. You wake up already adjusted, already oriented toward waiting, already prepared for partial satisfaction. The wanting does not go away. It simply loses its edge. This is where discomfort begins to feel like anticipation. Anticipation is easier to tolerate than loss. Loss suggests finality. Anticipation suggests continuation. When absence repeats without closure, the mind reframes it as waiting rather than deprivation. Waiting feels purposeful. Loss feels empty. So the system chooses the frame that hurts less. You tell yourself you are patient, that timing matters, that things unfold slowly. These interpretations are not lies. They are coping structures. Over time, the emotional tone shifts, the ache dulls, the alertness remains. You still think about what is missing, but without urgency. The longing hums rather than screams. This is normalization. Repeated absence reshapes expectations. You stop expecting fulfillment. You start expecting delay. You stop expecting clarity. You start expecting ambiguity. What once would have felt unsatisfying now feels familiar enough to be accepted. Research on emotional conditioning shows that when a stimulus consistently produces low-level discomfort without resolution, individuals often reinterpret the discomfort as part of the experience rather than a problem to solve. The mind adapts by redefining what feels acceptable. You no longer measure the situation against fullness. You measure it against habit. This is why longing can persist for so long without collapse. It has been domesticated. You might notice how strange it feels when absence suddenly ends. When presence arrives fully without delay, the intensity can feel almost overwhelming, not because it is too much, but because your system has adapted to less. Fulfillment disrupts the equilibrium you built around wanting. In some cases, fulfillment even feels wrong. This reaction is rarely discussed, but it is common. When the baseline has shifted toward lack, fullness feels unfamiliar. The body does not immediately trust it. The mind searches for the next absence. The system has learned to live in anticipation, not arrival. This does not mean you prefer longing consciously. It means your nervous system has learned its shape. Normalization also affects identity. You begin to see yourself as someone who waits, someone who hopes quietly, someone who understands complexity and delay. This self-image feels mature, controlled. It masks the fact that your emotional reference point has moved. You are no longer comparing the situation to what you need. You are comparing it to what you have learned to tolerate. Everyday signs of this shift are easy to miss. You feel less surprised by disappointment. You no longer ask direct questions, because uncertainty feels safer than answers. You avoid moments that might force clarity, not because you fear truth, but because clarity would disrupt the rhythm you have adapted to. The wanting has become part of your internal landscape. Behavioral psychology describes this as adaptation-level theory. People judge experiences not against objective standards, but against their current baseline. When the baseline changes, evaluation changes with it. What once felt like deprivation can come to feel neutral. This is not resilience. It is adjustment. Longing stops feeling like loss when it no longer signals deviation from normal. Loss requires contrast. When absence is constant, contrast disappears. The emotional system stops treating it as absence and starts treating it as context. You live inside the wanting rather than against it. This shift can feel strangely calming. The early stages of longing are restless. The later stages are quiet. The mind stops fighting. It accepts the conditions and continues functioning. This acceptance is not resolution, it is accommodation. Accommodation feels peaceful because resistance has ended. But something else happens as well. When longing is normalized, motivation changes. You stop seeking fulfillment actively. You start managing longing instead. Your energy goes into maintaining balance within the lack, rather than altering the situation that created it. This is how hunger stops directing behavior. In biological terms, hunger motivates action until it is satisfied. In psychological terms, chronic unmet desire often loses its directive force. The system learns that action does not lead to resolution, so it conserves energy. The wanting remains, but it no longer pushes. You still care, you just no longer move. This is one of the most overlooked consequences of prolonged absence. It does not always intensify desire. Sometimes it anesthesias it. The desire becomes quieter but deeper, less urgent but more embedded. You may notice how this state feels reflective, thoughtful, even poetic. Longing that has settled can feel profound. It feels like depth because it has lasted. Duration is mistaken for significance. But duration alone does not mean nourishment. The mind adapts to what it cannot change. It reframes. It lowers expectations. It normalizes conditions. This is adaptive in survival contexts. In emotional contexts, it can quietly erode standards without detection. You are not consciously choosing less. You are becoming accustomed to it. This is why longing can persist without protest. Why it stops feeling like loss and starts feeling like part of who you are. The system has recalibrated. The absence no longer triggers alarm. It triggers familiarity. Familiarity feels safe even when it is empty. The most unsettling part is how invisible this process is while it unfolds. There is no clear moment where you decide to accept less. There is only gradual adjustment. One recalibration at a time. One quiet tolerance layered onto the next. By the time you notice, the baseline has already moved. You might still describe the feeling as wanting, but it no longer carries urgency. It no longer insists on resolution. It has become a low, steady presence, something you live with rather than respond to. This is where longing becomes identity rather than signal. The system is no longer asking for change. It is maintaining equilibrium within deprivation. That equilibrium can last a long time, long enough to feel normal, long enough to feel chosen. Understanding this does not immediately reverse it. Awareness rarely does, but it exposes something important. Longing stops feeling like loss when loss becomes familiar. And the question that lingers quietly and without answer is not how much you wanted. It is how long you lived inside wanting before you stopped noticing what it replaced. Chapter 6. Erosion of Emotional Certainty. There is a quiet moment you tend to ignore. It happens when you realize you are no longer sure where you stand, yet you remain exactly where you are. Certainty is thinned, confidence is eroded. But the desire has not left. It has simply learned how to exist without answers. This is where things become difficult to name. In the beginning, trust feels solid. You sense coherence. Actions align enough with expectations that your mind relaxes. You do not analyze every signal. You do not question every pause. Certainty creates a kind of emotional gravity. It holds everything in place. But when inconsistency enters, it does not shatter trust all at once. It wears it down gradually. Small contradictions appear. Warmth followed by distance. Presence followed by silence. Nothing dramatic, nothing final. Just enough misalignment to introduce doubt. Doubt does not end attachment. It reshapes it. Psychological research on trust formation shows that trust is not binary. It degrades in increments. When behavior becomes unpredictable, trust weakens, but the emotional bond often remains intact. The mind separates reliability from attachment. You stop expecting consistency, but you do not stop wanting connection. This separation is unsettling because it allows two opposing states to coexist. You begin to feel less sure, yet no less drawn. Clarity fades quietly. You notice it in how you think. You stop assuming. You start wondering. You no longer feel certain about intentions, but you still feel invested in outcomes. The desire does not require clarity to survive. In some cases, clarity threatens it. Hope fills the space certainty leaves behind. Hope is not confidence. It does not rest on evidence. It rests on possibility. And possibility can survive almost anything except finality. As long as nothing is conclusively denied, hope remains viable. The mind holds on to it, not because it is rational, but because it is unresolved. This is how desire persists even as certainty dissolves. You may recognize this in everyday interactions. You no longer trust the pattern, but you still wait for the message. You no longer believe the promise, but you still imagine the moment it might be fulfilled. The emotional system is adjusted. It no longer requires reliability. It only requires the chance of return. Inconsistency weakens trust without breaking attachment, because attachment is not built on logic. It is built on repetition and emotional imprinting. Once established, it does not dissolve simply because understanding erodes. It lingers, it adapts. Studies in attachment psychology show that bonds formed under unpredictable conditions often become more anxious, but also more persistent. The uncertainty activates monitoring behavior. You stay alert, you stay engaged. The bond changes shape, but it does not disappear. You stop relying on certainty. You start relying on hope. Hope is flexible. It can coexist with doubt. It can survive disappointment. It does not need coherence. It only needs the absence of closure. As long as the story is unfinished, hope remains functional. This is why inconsistency can feel confusing rather than decisive. You are not being convinced to leave. You are being kept suspended. The mind adapts to this suspension by lowering expectations. This adjustment happens quietly. You do not announce it to yourself. You simply begin expecting less. Lowered expectations feel like realism. They feel mature. You tell yourself you are no longer naive. You understand complexity now. You accept ambiguity. These narratives help stabilize the discomfort created by uncertainty. But something else is happening beneath that language. The emotional system recalibrates to survive the inconsistency. It stops expecting clarity. It stops expecting reassurance. It stops expecting follow-through. In doing so, it protects itself from repeated shock. The cost is subtle. Certainty erodes, but desire remains. You no longer feel secure. You feel hopeful. Hope is quieter than certainty. It does not settle the body. It keeps it slightly tense, slightly alert, always ready for change. This state can persist for a long time without breaking. The system learns how to live inside it. This is not indecision. It is adaptation. Doubt coexists with desire because they operate in different domains. Doubt evaluates information. Desire responds to emotional imprint. One can weaken while the other stays intact. You can question the situation while still feeling pulled toward it. This coexistence feels paradoxical. You wonder why you cannot simply let go once certainty is gone. The answer is not weakness, it is conditioning. The bond was formed when signals were strong enough to matter. Those signals do not disappear simply because new information contradicts them. The emotional memory remains active. It continues to influence attention and motivation even as conscious belief changes. You begin to live with internal contradiction. You think, I am not sure, and still feel I want. The mind tolerates this split by compartmentalizing. You keep your doubt intellectual. You keep your desire emotional. They rarely confront each other directly. This allows the attachment to survive in a diminished but persistent form. Everyday signs of this erosion are easy to overlook. You stop making assumptions about the future, but you still imagine it. You stop trusting consistency, but you still respond to moments of warmth. You no longer expect stability, but you still feel disappointment when it does not appear. This pattern is draining but familiar. Research on cognitive dissonance shows that when people hold conflicting beliefs and emotions, they often resolve the tension by adjusting expectations rather than behavior. You do not leave the situation, you change how much you expect from it. This adjustment reduces internal conflict while preserving attachment. You begin to say things like, I do not need much, or I understand how things are, or this is just how it is. These statements sound grounded. In reality, they reflect a system that has adapted to uncertainty by shrinking its demands. Certainty fades because it is no longer supported by evidence. Desire remains because it no longer requires evidence. This is the quiet erosion. Trust does not collapse. It thins. It becomes conditional. You trust moments, not patterns. You trust feelings, not promises. You trust glimpses, not continuity. This fragmented trust keeps you engaged without offering stability. You are not fully in and not fully out. The mind prefers this state to definitive loss. Definitive loss requires grieving. Ambiguity postpones it. As long as certainty is not fully disappeared, desire can survive in the margins. This is why doubt often fails to extinguish longing. Longing feeds on possibility, not assurance. It does not need clarity to exist. In fact, clarity often threatens it. Clear answers force decisions. Decisions end suspension. Suspension sustains desire. You may notice how quickly desire flares when certainty briefly returns. A moment of clarity, a clear expression, a sign of alignment. The relief is immediate. The bond feels alive again. When clarity fades, the desire does not disappear. It retreats, waiting for the next signal. This intermittent clarity strengthens the cycle. Each brief return of certainty renews hope. Each erosion makes you lower expectations further. Over time, the distance between what you want and what you expect widens. You want intensely but expect little. This imbalance becomes normalized. You live in hope rather than trust. This state can feel oddly stable. There are no sharp shocks anymore. You are no longer surprised by inconsistency. You have adapted. The system has learned how to function with minimal certainty. But something important has changed. You no longer rely on reality to sustain desire. Desire sustains itself. This is why the bond can persist long after certainty is gone. The desire has become self-referential. It no longer needs confirmation. It only needs the absence of finality. You might sense how dangerous this is without fully articulating it. Desire untethered from certainty does not correct itself. It does not recalibrate easily. It can persist in conditions that no longer support it. Understanding this does not immediately dissolve the attachment. Awareness rarely does, but it reveals the mechanism. Desire survives the erosion of certainty because it has adapted to operate without it. The mind lowers expectations to protect attachment. Doubt is allowed to exist as long as hope remains intact. The system sacrifices clarity to preserve continuity. And the most unsettling part is how reasonable this feels while it is happening. You tell yourself you are being patient, flexible, understanding. In reality, you are living inside a structure where desire no longer depends on truth. The question that lingers is not why certainty faded. It is how much certainty had to disappear before you stopped needing it at all. Chapter 7. Emotional Fatigue. You rarely notice the moment your resistance begins to fail. Not because something dramatic happens, but because nothing does. The tension simply lasts longer than you expected, longer than feels reasonable, longer than your mind was designed to tolerate. You sense this, even if you do not name it. The quiet exhaustion that settles in when answers do not come, when clarity is delayed, when emotional signals arrive inconsistently, never fully absent, never fully reliable. At first you tell yourself you are patient, then you tell yourself you are strong. Eventually you stop telling yourself anything at all. What wears you down is not rejection. It is uncertainty without resolution. Psychological research has long observed that sustained ambiguity demands constant cognitive effort. The brain keeps scanning, predicting, correcting. Each unanswered question remains active. Each unresolved emotion consumes resources. Over time, this load does not remain neutral. It drains. You feel this drain in small ways, a heaviness behind ordinary thoughts, a softening of boundaries you once maintained without effort. You stop evaluating situations with precision. You begin evaluating them by how much relief they promise. The mind, under prolonged uncertainty, changes its priorities. Accuracy becomes less important than comfort. Certainty becomes less important than closure. This is not weakness. It is conservation. You notice it when you accept explanations that once felt insufficient. When vague reassurance feels better than silence. When tension, at least familiar tension, feels preferable to the emptiness of not knowing. The nervous system does not crave truth. It craves stability. Emotional fatigue develops quietly. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive as collapse. It arrives as accommodation. At first, you wait. You replay interactions. You analyze tone, timing, gaps. You tell yourself you are simply trying to understand. This is effort, sustained effort. As time passes, the effort becomes heavier. Your interpretations lose sharpness. Your standards soften. What once felt unacceptable begins to feel tolerable, not because it improved, but because you are tired of holding the tension it creates. This is the moment many people misinterpret as growth or maturity. They tell themselves they are letting go, being flexible, not needing as much. In reality, something else is happening. The mind is reducing strain by lowering demand. You see this in everyday situations. A message that arrives late but still arrives. A promise fulfilled inconsistently but not abandoned entirely. An explanation that avoids detail but offers warmth. Each of these provides just enough stimulation to prevent disengagement, and just enough ambiguity to keep effort alive. The brain responds by recalibrating. Expectation lowers. Hope remains. The gap between the two becomes livable. Psychological studies on cognitive load and decision fatigue show that prolonged mental strain narrows evaluative capacity. When resources are depleted, people default to the option that minimizes immediate discomfort, even if it sacrifices long-term clarity. This applies to emotions as much as choices. You are not persuaded in these moments. You are depleted. There is a subtle relief in this depletion. The constant vigilance eases, the sharp edges dull. You stop questioning every inconsistency. You stop demanding internal coherence from the situation. You accept partial answers. Half presence, conditional reassurance. The tension remains, but it changes texture. It becomes familiar, predictable, almost comforting in its persistence. This is where desire often intensifies rather than fades. Not because conditions improved, but because disengaging would require energy you no longer want to spend. Letting go is not passive. It requires resolution. Resolution requires strength. Emotional fatigue creates a paradox. The more tired you become, the harder it feels to walk away. Not because attachment deepens in a healthy way, but because separation would introduce a new wave of uncertainty, a new cognitive burden, a fresh set of unanswered questions. So the mind stays, not out of passion, out of conservation. You might notice yourself reframing discomfort as meaning, telling yourself that tension indicates depth, that uncertainty indicates complexity, that exhaustion is the price of something valuable. These interpretations do not arise randomly. They arise to protect you from the strain of contradiction. The nervous system prefers a coherent story, even a flawed one, over none at all. Over time, acceptance arrives, not as a conscious decision, as a physiological settling. Muscles relax, questions quiet, the emotional field narrows. You tell yourself you're fine with how things are, and in a sense you are. Your system has adapted. Desire becomes less about connection and more about relief, less about presence and more about continuity. As long as the situation persists, the mind does not have to confront loss or emptiness. Research on attachment under stress shows that when individuals experience sustained unpredictability, attachment behaviors often intensify even as satisfaction decreases. The system clings not because it is nourished, but because it is depleted. You feel this when you notice that disappointment no longer surprises you, when emotional letdowns feel routine rather than shocking, when you prepare for absence instead of hoping for presence. This preparation is exhausting, but it is familiar, and familiarity to a tired mind feels safer than the unknown. At this stage, resistance does not break, it dissolves. You stop asking whether something is enough. You ask whether it is tolerable, whether it hurts less than the alternative, whether it allows you to avoid starting over. The mind does not give in because it is convinced. It gives in because it is tired of standing. This fatigue is not visible from the outside. Others may see calm acceptance, even contentment. Inside, the system has simply stopped pushing back. You are still aware of the imbalance. You have not forgotten what certainty feels like. You have not stopped wanting clarity. You have just learned to live without it. And living without it costs less energy than fighting for it. There is a quiet grief in this adjustment, not dramatic enough to demand attention, not painful enough to force change, just enough to linger. You may recognize it in moments of silence, when you realize you no longer expect to be surprised, when anticipation feels dull rather than electric, when desire exists without excitement, This is emotional fatigue in its final form, not collapse, accommodation. The unsettling truth is that many forms of attachment do not endure because they are fulfilling. They endure because disengagement feels more exhausting than endurance. So when the mind finally settles into acceptance, the question remains unspoken. Was it persuaded by meaning, or simply worn down by waiting? Chapter 8. Repetition without resolution. There is a part of you that stays longer than it should, not because you believe things will change, but because they have not ended. You sense this pull even when you deny it, the quiet gravity of what remains unresolved, the way unfinished emotional loops refuse to loosen their grip. Completion brings relief, but it also brings finality, and finality requires letting go of possibility. What remains unresolved keeps possibility alive, even if it is thin, even if it is painful. The mind often prefers an open wound to a sealed one, because an open wound still feels connected. You notice this in the smallest repetitions, conversations that circle the same point without landing, patterns of contact that repeat without deepening, moments that almost clarify something, then retreat into ambiguity. Each cycle feels familiar. Each cycle feels survivable. The brain is not neutral toward repetition. Neuroscience shows that repeated patterns, even stressful ones, become encoded as predictable. Predictability lowers immediate threat responses. What is known, even if uncomfortable, requires less energy than what is unknown. This is why unresolved cycles gain strength over time. They do not escalate dramatically, they normalize. At first, the lack of resolution feels irritating. You expect clarity, you wait for it. When it does not arrive, you feel tension, but as the cycle repeats, the tension becomes part of the baseline. Your system adjusts. Psychological research on habituation shows that repeated exposure to the same emotional stimulus reduces conscious distress without resolving the underlying need. The discomfort does not disappear. It becomes quieter, easier to carry. You stop expecting completion. You start expecting repetition. This shift changes how desire operates. Desire no longer moves toward fulfillment. It moves toward continuation. You see this in everyday behavior, checking for messages that follow the same pattern every time, revisiting conversations in your mind that never conclude, returning emotionally to situations that have already shown you their limits. Not because they satisfy you, but because they are familiar. The unresolved creates a loop, and loops are powerful. Cognitive psychology describes this as the Zeigarnik effect. Unfinished tasks and incomplete narratives remain more active in memory than completed ones. The mind holds on to them, revisits them, and resists closure. This is not intentional, it is automatic. When applied to emotional attachment, the effect deepens. The absence of resolution keeps the system engaged. Attention does not release. Emotional energy continues to circulate. You may tell yourself you are simply patient, or loyal, or hopeful. But beneath those explanations, something quieter is happening. Your brain is clinging to a pattern it recognizes. Repetition creates familiarity. Familiarity creates safety. Not emotional safety, but neurological safety. Even tension, when repeated, becomes a known environment. The nervous system learns its rhythms, the rises and falls, the moments of anticipation and disappointment. It calibrates to them. Closure, by contrast, disrupts the pattern entirely. It removes the loop. It forces recalibration. It demands adjustment. Adjustment costs energy. This is why letting go often feels harder than staying. Staying requires endurance. Leaving requires transformation. You feel this when the idea of final clarity makes you uneasy. Not because you fear the truth, but because you fear the silence that follows it. The absence of the familiar tension, the emptiness where the pattern used to be. Unresolved cycles offer movement without progress, activity without outcome. They keep the emotional system busy. This busyness can feel like purpose, like investment, like meaning. Over time, desire attaches itself not to the outcome, but to the rhythm, the waiting, the checking, the return. This is how dependency forms without intention. Studies on intermittent reinforcement show that inconsistent rewards create stronger attachment than consistent ones. When outcomes are unpredictable, the brain increases engagement. Dopamine responses spike not at reward, but at anticipation. The system stays alert. Resolution ends anticipation. Repetition sustains it. You begin to notice that desire no longer asks for fulfillment. It asks for continuation. As long as the pattern persists, the mind does not have to confront loss. You may feel moments of frustration, moments of clarity where you recognize the loop. But recognition alone does not dissolve it, because the loop is no longer just cognitive, it is embodied. Your emotional system has learned this pattern. It knows how to exist inside it, does not know what comes after. This is why unresolved attachment often outlasts resolved disappointment. A clear ending allows grief to move. An unclear one traps emotion in suspension. Suspension feels safer than free fall. You see this when you replay interactions that ended without explanation. When your mind fills in gaps rather than releasing them. When imagination substitutes for certainty. The brain would rather speculate endlessly than accept an ending that offers no narrative. No meaning, no continuation. Repetition also blurs evaluation. When the same cycle repeats, you stop assessing it as an event. You accept it as a condition. Conditions are endured, not questioned. You stop asking whether this dynamic serves you. You ask whether it has changed. When it has not, you settle back into familiarity. This settling feels calm, but it is not resolution. It is accommodation. Over time, desire feeds on its own momentum. It no longer needs hope, it needs habit. Habit reduces friction. It allows emotional investment to continue without conscious choice. You do not decide to stay engaged each time. You simply do. This is how repetition sustains itself. Not through intensity, but through routine. You might notice that the idea of true closure feels strangely heavy. Final conversations, definitive endings, clear conclusions, they feel disruptive. Not because you believe they would hurt more, but because they would remove the pattern entirely. They would force the system to reorganize. And reorganization is uncomfortable. The unresolved offers a compromise. You remain attached without confronting finality. You remain hopeful without evidence. You remain invested without resolution. This state is draining, but it is stable. What you may not realize is that repetition without resolution does not keep desire alive by accident. It keeps it alive by design of the mind. The brain clings to what it can predict. Even if prediction includes disappointment. Even if it includes longing, because longing, when familiar, feels safer than emptiness. So you stay near what does not resolve. You orbit it, you revisit it. And somewhere in this repetition, desire stops asking for completion. It only asks to continue. The unresolved becomes harder to release than the complete, not because it offers more, but because it ends nothing. And as long as nothing ends, something inside you remains suspended, waiting and quietly unwilling to let go. Chapter 9. Identity anchored to wanting. There is a desire you do not question anymore. Not because it is fulfilled, but because it has become familiar. It has been with you long enough to feel personal, quietly woven into how you understand yourself. You sense this when you imagine it disappearing, not being replaced, not resolved, simply gone. The absence feels unsettling in a way that goes beyond loss. It feels like erasure. Psychology has long observed that identity is not built only from what we have, but from what we pursue. Goals, attachments, and long-term desires become reference points. They organize memory, they structure meaning, they give continuity to the self. When a desire remains unresolved, it does something subtle. It stops being an objective, it becomes a definition. You are not just someone who wants something, you become someone who is wanting. This shift happens gradually. There is no clear moment when desire crosses into identity. It accumulates through repetition, through time spent thinking, anticipating, interpreting, through the quiet labor of holding something in mind without resolution. The brain prefers coherence. Cognitive psychology shows that humans are driven to maintain a consistent narrative of who they are. When a desire persists long enough, it is integrated into that narrative. It explains choices. It justifies endurance. It offers a storyline. You notice this when you describe your past. Certain absences are not framed as gaps. They are framed as chapters, as defining tensions, as evidence of depth. The absence becomes meaningful, not because it is productive, but because it is familiar. Identity is reinforced by continuity. What remains constant feels true. When wanting persists, it gains authority. Over time, the desire is no longer evaluated by its outcomes. It is protected because it supports the self-concept. This is why letting go can feel destabilizing, not because the desire is irreplaceable, but because it has been carrying weight. It has been doing work. It has answered questions quietly. Why you stayed, why you waited, why you invested attention where clarity never arrived. Without it, those explanations loosen. Research in narrative psychology shows that people construct identity as a story with causal links. Events are interpreted to preserve a sense of meaning. Longing fits easily into this structure. It offers a through line, a tension that justifies patience and persistence. When the desire remains unresolved, it never contradicts the narrative. It never forces revision. It can always be framed as ongoing. Completion, by contrast, demands reinterpretation. If the desire ends without fulfillment, the story fractures. If it ends with fulfillment, the tension disappears. Either way, the identity must adjust. Adjustment is uncomfortable. You may notice how often wanting is used as proof of significance. The idea that intensity reflects depth, that sustained longing indicates importance, that what matters most is what hurts to release. These assumptions are culturally reinforced, but psychologically they serve another function. They protect attachment by moralizing it. Wanting becomes evidence, not of value in the object, but of value in the self. You are not attached because the situation is healthy. You are attached because you are capable of deep desire. This reframing preserves identity even when outcomes disappoint. Over time, the absence itself becomes personalized. It is no longer just something missing, it is something that belongs to you. You feel this when the thought of moving on triggers guilt rather than relief, as if releasing the desire would mean betraying something essential, as if you would be abandoning a version of yourself that endured. This reaction is not irrational. It is consistent with identity-protective cognition. The mind resists information or change that threatens self-coherence. Letting go would require admitting that the desire was not defining, that the time invested did not need to shape who you are, that meaning could be restructured. That admission feels destabilizing. So the mind defends the desire. It reframes absence as depth, longing as loyalty, waiting as character. Subtle examples appear everywhere. People describe themselves through what they have not yet attained, through relationships that never stabilized, through futures that remained hypothetical. These are not failures of awareness, they are adaptations. Desire provides structure when certainty is absent. It gives direction to attention. It fills silence with intention. Neuroscience shows that the brain's reward system responds not only to reward, but to pursuit. Dopamine activity is sustained by anticipation. When anticipation becomes chronic, it integrates into motivation systems. The pursuit itself becomes reinforcing. This is where identity begins to anchor. You do not just want, you are oriented around wanting. This orientation influences perception. Opportunities that threaten to resolve the desire may be subconsciously avoided, not because they are wrong, but because they would dissolve the role you have been inhabiting. Resolution removes the need for endurance, and endurance has become familiar. The longer this continues, the more the self adapts. Emotional energy is allocated around the desire. Time is organized with reference to it. Even mood fluctuations begin to align with its rhythms. At this point, the desire is no longer external, it is internal architecture. This is why questions about letting go feel existential rather than practical. They do not ask what you would lose, they ask who you would be without it. Identity research shows that people resist changes that threaten narrative continuity more strongly than changes that threaten comfort. It is easier to endure discomfort than incoherence, so wanting is preserved, not because it satisfies, but because it stabilizes. You may notice moments when the desire feels empty, when anticipation no longer excites, when longing feels mechanical. Even then it persists, because by now it is not feeding pleasure. It is feeding identity. This creates a quiet trap. The desire no longer points forward, it points inward. It validates past investment. It confirms emotional depth. It protects the story you tell yourself about who you are. Ending it would require rewriting that story, not dramatically, but fundamentally. You would have to accept that meaning can exist without sustained longing, that identity does not require absence, that wanting is not the same as significance. These realizations are destabilizing, so they are postponed. The desire remains, not because it is compelling, but because it is familiar. You may sense that part of you is maintained by this wanting, a version of yourself defined by patience, by emotional endurance, by silent investment. If it disappeared, that version would dissolve, and something new would have to take its place. The mind hesitates there, not because it fears emptiness, but because it fears undefined space. So the desire stays, quietly, persistently, anchoring identity through absence. And if one day it were truly gone, the question would not be what you lost, but which version of yourself you would no longer need to be. Chapter 10. When absence gains authority. There is a form of influence that does not announce itself. It does not interrupt. It does not demand. It simply waits and you adjust. You have felt this before, not pressure, not force, but a quiet recalibration of your behavior around something that is not there. This is the unsettling truth. Absence can begin to shape you more precisely than presence ever did. Psychology does not define power only as action. Power is also anticipation, expectation. The silent waiting of future possibility. When something might return, your mind begins to prepare space for it, not consciously, automatically. This is how absence gains authority. Authority does not require visibility. It requires relevance. The moment a possibility begins influencing decisions, it has power. You notice it in small adjustments. You hesitate before committing to alternatives. You leave margins unfilled. You keep options open without naming why. These behaviors feel neutral, even responsible, but they are shaped by something unseen. Cognitive research shows that humans are highly sensitive to potential outcomes, even when probabilities are low. The brain does not weigh likelihood alone, it weighs significance. When a potential return feels meaningful, it begins to override present data. Decisions are no longer based solely on what is happening. They are shaped by what could happen. This is not imagination, it is neural economy. The mind is designed to conserve opportunity. When a perceived opportunity remains unresolved, the brain keeps it active. Working memory returns to it repeatedly. Attention orbits it. Over time, this orbit becomes structure. You may notice that your choices subtly align to avoid closing doors. Not because you expect something to happen, but because you fear eliminating the possibility. This fear is not dramatic. It is procedural. Behavioral psychology describes this as option preservation. When an outcome carries emotional weight, people unconsciously sacrifice present clarity to protect future access. This is where authority begins. Nothing is present, nothing is promised. Yet behavior adapts. Power operates most efficiently when it does not need to assert itself. When compliance is self-generated. You see this in everyday situations. Messages not sent, plans postponed, boundaries softened. Each choice appears independent. Together they form alignment. The absence does not ask. It does not persuade. It does not explain. It simply exists as a possibility, and the mind responds. Neuroscience shows that anticipated reward activates similar neural pathways as actual reward. Dopamine responds to expectation as much as outcome. This means the body reacts to what is not happening almost as strongly as to what is. The future becomes neurologically present. When this happens, the source of anticipation gains leverage, not through action but through potential. This is why power can operate without presence. You are not responding to reality. You are responding to a projection stabilized by hope. Hope does not require evidence. It requires relevance. Once relevance is established, the mind does the rest. You may believe you are waiting, but psychologically you are adjusting. Waiting is not passive. It is active regulation. You regulate expectations. You regulate exposure. You regulate decisions to maintain alignment with a possibility that has no physical form. Over time, this alignment becomes habitual. Habits feel neutral because they repeat quietly, but they shape behavior more reliably than intention. The absence gains authority when it no longer needs reinforcement. When its influence is assumed at this stage, presence would actually reduce its power. Because presence introduces limits, absence remains undefined. Undefined possibilities resist evaluation. They cannot be confirmed or dismissed. They remain open. The mind prefers open loop. Research on the Zeigarnik effect shows that unresolved situations retain cognitive priority. They occupy attention longer than completed ones. This priority translates into influence. You may notice how easily behavior is justified around this absence. You tell yourself you are being cautious, patient, open-minded. These interpretations are not false, but they obscure the mechanism. Your behavior is no longer guided by what is, but by what must not be lost. Loss aversion plays a critical role. Psychological studies consistently show that humans are more motivated to avoid loss than to achieve gain. When a possibility is framed as something that could be lost, it gains disproportionate influence. Even when it has never been possessed, this is where authority becomes invisible. You are not responding to control. You are responding to prevention. You shape your actions to avoid foreclosing a future that may never arrive. And in doing so, you grant power to what is absent. This power is quiet because it feels voluntary. No one instructs you, no one pressures you. No one pressures you. The obedience is internal. You may notice that clarity begins to feel dangerous. Finality feels aggressive. Closure feels premature. This is not indecision, it is alignment with uncertainty. Uncertainty preserves authority because it prevents reassessment. As long as something remains unresolved, it cannot be evaluated accurately. And as long as it cannot be evaluated, it remains influential. The absence becomes a reference point. Other options are compared to it. Other decisions are delayed because of it. This is how power operates without presence. It shapes the environment around itself. Psychologically, this mirrors attachment patterns where perceived availability matters more than actual contact. Attachment does not require interaction. It requires belief in potential access. Once that belief is installed, behavior reorganizes. You begin to anticipate reactions that are not happening. You imagine responses that are not being given. You manage yourself in relation to an imagined future interaction. This imagined interaction becomes more influential than real ones. The mind obeys what it hopes for because hope simplifies uncertainty. It offers direction in the absence of information. Direction feels stabilizing, so the absence is protected, not because it is powerful in itself, but because it provides orientation. This is the paradox. The less that is present, the more room there is for influence. Presence introduces friction. Absence invites compliance. You may notice how easily authority transfers from reality to expectation, from what is known to what is imagined. At this point, the absence does not need to act. It does not need to return. It does not need to explain itself. Its authority is already installed. Behavior bends around it. You schedule your life with it in mind. You interpret signals in its favor. You maintain readiness for something undefined. This readiness feels responsible. But it is also submission, not to a person, not to an event, to a possibility. Psychologically, this is one of the most efficient forms of control. It requires no maintenance, no reinforcement, no presence. Once the mind commits to preserving access, it governs itself. You may ask where control truly resides in this dynamic. It is not with the absent object. It is not with the future. It is within the structure of anticipation you now inhabit. Authority has shifted inward. The absence does not hold power. The mind gives it power. And as long as behavior continues to adjust in its direction, the authority remains intact. No demands, no rules, no confirmation, only alignment. And the longer this continues, the harder it becomes to distinguish choice from obedience, because nothing is physically there, and yet something is being followed. Chapter 11. Awareness as Aftermath. There is a truth that often escapes notice until it has already shaped you. You sense it only after patterns have entrenched themselves in thought and attention, in the quiet adjustments of daily life. By then, recognition arrives as a muted shock, almost irrelevant to the momentum already established. You have felt this, not as a revelation, but as an echo, a realization that emerges when the mind finally names what it has been doing unconsciously. It is unsettling because it arrives late. After the work has been done, after the attachments are entrenched. Psychology explains this as delayed awareness. The brain encodes patterns, reinforces habits, and establishes emotional loops long before the conscious mind perceives them. By the time insight occurs, the architecture is complete. Recognition is retrospective. It explains the past without altering the present. Consider how attention subtly shifts over weeks or months. You respond to absence before noticing its influence. You anticipate, wait, hope, and adjust. All quietly, all without conscious acknowledgement. When finally you see it, you are aware that the mind has already yielded. Cognitive research into conditioning shows that behavior often becomes self-sustaining before conscious evaluation intervenes. Neural circuits are strengthened by repetition, by the habitual pursuit of uncertain rewards. Insight, however, does not immediately dissolve attachment. Understanding does not rewrite conditioned response. Awareness is in a sense after the fact. You may recall moments when clarity emerged too late, when you could label your own patterns yet could not undo them. Perhaps you noticed how your attention lingered, how choices were unconsciously swayed, how your perception bent toward possibility without permission. Recognition arrived, but it did not change the sway of prior investment. This is why awareness can feel impotent. It illuminates, but it rarely reverses. The emotional hold, the internal logic that sustains desire and adherence remains intact. Once the mind has adapted to uncertainty, once it has normalized tension and embedded longing, cognition alone cannot dismantle it. Every interaction you thought you guided voluntarily was already influenced by patterns long in place. Every hesitation, every hope, every subtle alignment had a foundation you did not perceive. The mind was molding behavior while the conscious self remained an observer. Neuroscience demonstrates that the brain prioritizes consistency. Once patterns are established, they persist. New understanding may adjust perception slightly, but it cannot instantly recalibrate motivation or attachment. The emotional and behavioral architecture endures. This is the quiet danger of delayed insight. You believe comprehension will liberate you. It does not. It merely offers perspective, a lens through which the entrenchment is suddenly visible. Liberation requires deliberate effort, often uncomfortable, often resisted by the mind that has already found stability in its conditioned loops. Consider the way memory consolidates experience. Repeated attention to absence, to uncertainty, to the potential for return becomes encoded as significance. The patterns are reinforced not by presence, but by expectation. When you finally understand this influence, the influence itself is already in place. You recognize that your decisions have not been made entirely by conscious choice. You realize that longing, waiting, adjusting, and hope have shaped priorities, constrained opportunities, and guided subtle actions, all before awareness had the chance to intervene. This is why insight can feel like an aftermath. Not a rescue, not a reversal, but a report of what has already occurred. You observe the machinery only after it has set the rhythms of thought and action. In everyday life, this appears in small ways, a recurring attraction you cannot explain, a patience that feels unnatural, a readiness for something that never arrives, and only after years, perhaps, do you perceive the invisible forces that have been orchestrating your attention. It is a quiet exposure. You see the patterns, you see your compliance, you see the subtle yield of will to expectation, and the realization is disquieting because it reveals complicity you cannot retract. Even when you are aware, the mind does not abandon its investments lightly. Neural circuits maintain their influence. Anticipation continues to guide attention. Desire persists, even with comprehension. Because adaptation has occurred before observation, this creates a peculiar tension. You understand the past, but cannot fully reclaim it. You perceive the invisible structures, yet they remain active. The mind knows how to protect its orientation, even in the face of new insight. Perhaps you have felt this with a lingering attachment that seems irrational only in retrospect, or a habitual return to longing that defies conscious recognition. Awareness explains, but it does not dissolve. It arrives as witness, not as intervention. The quiet truth is that understanding often comes too late to feel useful. It illuminates after the architecture of desire, of expectation, of subtle behavioral alignment has been firmly constructed. Recognition is not the cause. And so you are left with knowledge, with insight, with the awareness that the patterns were already in motion before you could name them. You notice, perhaps with discomfort, the degree to which your mind had quietly aligned itself without consent. If you can see it now, you may ask yourself, when did it truly begin? Not at the moment of conscious comprehension, but long before you realized that the mind had been quietly guiding you, orchestrating anticipation, sustaining attachment, shaping choices, and cementing identity around what was never fully present. And the lingering question remains, if insight arrives after influence has been established, who is truly in control? Conclusion: the cost of knowing. There is a subtle cost to understanding. You have felt it, though perhaps you did not name it. The tension that occupied attention, the quiet pull toward something not present, the anticipation that rearranged days, choices, and priorities. It never appeared as control. It never knocked on the door and announced itself. Instead, it lingered invisibly, a quiet suggestion that grew louder only in the absence of clarity. Curiosity, desire, chemistry, they were the surface, the mask for a deeper mechanism that operated without notice. By the time recognition arrives, the reorganization is complete. Emotions have shifted, expectations have bent, even identity has been subtly realigned. The mind adapts quietly, accepting the absence as context, adjusting instinctively. This is why awareness feels insufficient. Insight illuminates, but it does not undo. It does not restore the neutrality that existed before attention was captured. Observe the ways this is manifested in ordinary life. A pause in communication that feels significant, a thought that returns repeatedly to what is uncertain, an emotional alignment that no longer reflects desire itself, but the structure that absence has imposed. These are not imagined, they are measurable. Neurological studies show that expectation can activate the same pathways as the actual reward. Your mind, without conscious intent, has been rehearsing the possibility as though it were real. And so understanding is both clarity and disquiet. You see the invisible influence that shaped choices long before awareness arrived. You notice how easily your priorities shifted, how subtle adjustments became habitual, how longing became internalized as identity. Recognition does not liberate, it only exposes. The comfort of not knowing, the sense that desire was purely organic, is gone. This is the quiet cost of knowing. The mechanisms are visible, but the entanglement remains. Absence has authority precisely because it operates without challenge. You did not yield to coercion, you adapted, you complied. But compliance here is not submission to force. It is submission to the invisible logic of expectation. Consider the consequences. Attachment persists. Hope persists. Behavior continues to orbit the unseen influence, even when conscious thought names it as such. Desire has been cultivated without direct presence, without promise, without affirmation. It is a product of subtle reinforcement, of gaps filled by imagination, of anticipation allowed to govern. And yet, the mind continues to defend its choices. Rationalizations arise naturally. You believe that wanting was genuine, that attention was voluntary, but the patterns reveal otherwise. Oh, your engagement has been shaped not by what was given, but by what was withheld. The most unsettling part is that this shaping feels personal. It is intimate. It is woven into thought, feeling, and action in ways that appear autonomous, yet the origin is external, silent, absent. Control without presence has been achieved. This is why distance creates fascination, why unavailability strengthens attachment, why absence exerts authority where presence might have failed. The mind learns to orient toward potential rather than reality. It adapts to gaps, to delays, to unpredictability. And the adaptation endures beyond understanding. You may reflect on this and feel a sense of unease, that you have been guided by forces unseen, that desire so compelling and real may have been shaped by the invisible architecture of anticipation, that the longing you once believed to be authentic was cultivated by what was never delivered. And now you know, the quiet truth is visible, the patterns are exposed, yet the mind does not unlearn them immediately. Awareness is retrospective. It arrives after the influence has embedded itself, after behavior has been subtly rewired. This is the final paradox. The mechanism can be named, traced, understood. But understanding does not free you from its consequence. It does not undo the shift in attention, the reshaping of priorities, the subtle redefinition of self. You recognize the process, but the aftermath lingers. You see how absence governed more effectively than presence. You feel the imprint of desire shaped in silence, in distance, in inaccessibility. And you realize that knowledge comes not as liberation, but as exposure. Once you see why wanting grew stronger in the space where nothing was given, you are left with a question that has no easy answer. Was the desire ever genuine? Or was it always the product of what was never offered? And as you consider it, you sense a shadow still at the edge of thought, a quiet presence guiding attention. Even now, in the absence of its origin, the cost of knowing is not freedom. It is the awareness that the mind can be shaped quietly, persistently, long before the self is capable of seeing it, and that some forces once internalized may never be fully untangled. And in that realization, you are left with the quiet, lingering question: what part of your wanting is truly yours, and what part has been crafted in the spaces where nothing was ever given? Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with others who might find it helpful. Your support means everything and helps this channel grow and reach more people. And if you'd like to go even further in supporting the channel, consider joining as a member to get exclusive content and behind-the-scenes insights. Stay curious, stay powerful, and I'll see you in the next one.